Did everyone get something to eat if you were hungry?
It's delicious.
Thank you. Island Soul Restaurant. Okay, well, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone, and I'm Debbie Lacey with Eastside For All, and I'm first going to start reflecting, since we're here to reflect on the importance of place and people in community today, let us acknowledge the first peoples of this place. The Puget Sound region and East King County lie on the lands of the Coast Salish, the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Snoqualmie, Stillaguamish, and the Suquamish people. The land we are on, the land we occupy, belongs to people who are still here. We acknowledge this in gratitude to the indigenous communities who have held and continue to hold relationship with this land for generations. May this acknowledgement serve as an invitation to deeply reflect on our region's past and current colonialism, and to ask, what is our right work together in authentic partnership with indigenous communities and leaders? I want to thank Mayor Bernie and the City of Redmond for hosting us today. We have a round of applause for being in this beautiful city. I would like to welcome Mayor Bernie up for a few remarks. Thank you, Mayor Bernie.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I cannot tell you how excited I am to welcome you back into the city for a welcoming week opportunity. I recall in 2019, we had this amazing conversation about economic development across the hall in a tiny room with people crammed in there, and I know we're not doing those things anymore. But it was such a great conversation, and I loved how we pivoted during the pandemic and had opportunities of this online. But to be honest, having this opportunity to have this amazing speaker here in person, have conversations, breakout groups in conversation, for you to see each other face to face is just an amazing opportunity. And I am so grateful for you to come and join us in our city. I am going to apologize now because I've already not recognized one of my friends because she had a mask on. So if I say hello, nice to meet you, and you can remind me you've known me for 10 years, that would be great. Apparently, I don't know, transition between masks and Zoom and Teams to person. So just bear with me and pat me on the shoulder and tell me that it's okay. And we'll remember what it's like to be back in person again. I would be not doing my elected official job if I didn't say thank you to my council member, Melissa Stewart's here today to join us. And I also noticed in the back, we have Mayor Mary Lou Polly from the city of Issaquah, as well as council member Janet Zahn from the city of Bellevue. And if there's anyone else who's elected this year that I missed, Barbara to Michelle from Issaquah as well is here. And I saw you, once again, saw you earlier. Didn't work on my memory. Oh, is that Jane? Amy Lamb is here from Sammamish. Oh my gosh, see, here I am. Can't remember, can't see people, don't recognize them. It'll be okay for all of us. So give everyone some grace for being back in person, and I'm going to turn it back over, but I'm very excited to have you all here today, and thank you for joining us for Welcoming Week. It's a really important week in our area. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We can all relate to the grace needed at this time, right? So I'm excited. I first discovered Dr. Agyeman's teachings when trying to find information on interculturalism and placemaking and cross-cultural community centers and things like that. These are just things that I Google in my spare time. And I literally jumped out of my seat when I found Dr. Agyeman's writings and teachings. And for me, he was connecting all the dots, right? Racial justice, environmental sustainability, economic development, urban planning, intercultural communication, and belonging, always belonging. So I'm so grateful that he was able to travel from Boston to be with us today. Dr. Agyeman is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning and Fletcher Professor of Rhetoric and Debate at Tufts University. His combined science and social science background, together with extensive experience in local government, consulting, working for, and board-level advising of nonprofits and community-based organizations in the UK and the US, helps frame his perspectives, research, and writing. His Just Sustainabilities framework has deeply inspired me to reimagine so much of what I do and what's possible in our communities. Please welcome Dr. Julian Agyeman.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Mayor Bernie, everybody who invited me here. This is going to be the most weird sort of lecture that I've ever given. Hi, people online. I was just thinking, universities are configured so that the lecturer speaks to you, whereas council chambers are configured differently. So the public are on one side, and I speak then to the council chamber. Another first. This is my first kind of post-COVID presentation in person. So thank you, Seattle. Thank you, Redmond, for inviting me here. I've been doing this presentation online now for 2.5, nearly 3 years. So what I want to do then is to speak over the next 45 minutes or so about this concept of just sustainabilities and how it, I think, can provide a framework, as it has done for Debbie, to help you think about the integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. I couldn't list all of the different groups, but I picked up from my Native Land app. If you haven't got Native Land, the app, then you need to get it. You put in the zip code and it tells you on whose land you are. It's fantastic. I think the guy is from Vancouver that does it. But the two main groups that I got were the Coast Salish and the Duwamish people, but I understand from Debbie's introduction there are many different groups. I come from the land of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people, and I want to pay my respects to the elders, to their present, their futures, and their pasts in this meeting. So now I'm just going to show you a short piece done by our brothers and sisters, First Nations people in Canada, but it brings up some issues that I really want to flag up a lot in my presentation. And we're going to have a problem with the volume. Can you? Sorry about that. We have a complex system. Yes, we do. Okay. See how complex it is. Well, let's see if it works. Okay. Whoops. Even worse. We got it. There we go.
What does belonging look like if nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the streets, parks, buildings where you live? How can you ever feel welcome there? The Indigenous Placemaking Council seeks to restore Indigenous presence to Canadian cities, towns, and communities.
One of the things that I want you to hold on to there is the word belonging. What does belonging look like? He asks us the question, what does belonging look like if you can't see any of your people, your artifacts in the local communities? And I think about this in Boston. We have an African American history trail, we have all these history trails, but where's the evidence of the Massachusetts or Wampanoag people? Where do you see that? It's not in the travel brochures. There's a derisory sachem on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts plaque, but that's about it. we have erased the indigenous presence. So I want you to think a bit about this notion of belonging, so I'm going to come back to it. But let me start by really going into this notion of just sustainabilities. Just sustainabilities is an acknowledgement that really when we...
There, now it's on.
Now it's on.
Sorry.
Just sustainabilities is an acknowledgement that we've dislocated this really excellent concept called sustainability. We've prioritised the environmental aspects, and we know why we've prioritised them, because they're simpler, they're scientific, they're technical, they're measurable. The social justice aspects we haven't prioritised because they're much more difficult, but they're equally important. And so this book, Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, the psychologists tell me, by the way, if I leave this picture on for 45 seconds, 20% of you will be on the Amazon website buying this. So I just got to make sure I get the time. Academics sell books, it's how we live. But this book came out nearly 20 years ago now, and what was, I think, remarkable about it was that every chapter was about social justice and environmental sustainability. You can still buy books today that are about sustainability, and there's one chapter on equity and social justice. And guess who the authors get to write that chapter? I'm usually asked. I don't do that anymore. I want to see books on sustainability that are permeated by the ideas of social justice and environmental sustainability. So what we're really talking about is how do we balance environmental quality, which you have in abundance, with human equality? That's what we're trying to do. Why doesn't, for instance, Greenpeace talk more to Amnesty International? I would argue that we've failed on environmental quality and social justice because the two have never really talked to each other. But yet now I'm seeing books on social work coming out with phrases like green social work in an acknowledgement that social workers, where are they working? They're working in often the lowest income neighbourhoods. They need to know about environmental justice. So we do have the beginnings of professional practice coming together across these worlds. So I would argue that sustainability can't be seen as simply a green issue. We must connect with issues of social need, welfare and economic opportunity. They are integrally related into ecosystem integrity. Now again, I don't advertise other people's books often, but I really want you to think about this book. So this book was 2009. It was a book that was written by a couple of English researchers, and they got 40 years of data from around the world on inequality. And they looked at inequality, the gap between rich and poor in nations around the world. And the conclusion of the book really is that it's not poverty, it's inequality that is really eroding our lives for rich and poor. But what they found as well was that of these 100 or so nations, that the ones with the biggest gap between rich and poor were also the ones with the highest advertising revenues. Strange, why is that? Advertisers like inequality. Inequality sells. Inequality makes us buy stuff to make us feel better about ourselves, whether we're trying to get from the working class into the middle into the upper middle into the rich into the super rich, and then the super rich into the, oh my God, I'm Jeff Bezos class. We're on an escalator of consumption because of inequality. And inequality heightens competitive consumption. We've got to keep it up with the Joneses. But what does inequality also do? It heightens competitive consumption, which increases our carbon footprints. Inequality is a driver of climate change. Now, I love Bill McKibben, I know Bill McKibben, I know 350.org, and I know all the good work that they do, and they do good work. But they're always talking about sustainable transportation, sustainable agriculture. Yes, absolutely. But those are factors in helping ameliorate climate change. One of the drivers is inequality. We need to get serious about inequality. And if we really want to understand sustainability, therefore, I would say we need to understand both human equality and environmental quality, and we need to think about them together rather than as separate issues. So if we're going to define just sustainabilities, I think we can define it as the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. Okay? It's simple. But there's 4 conditions And one is we must commit to improving everyone's quality of life and well-being. Second is we must meet the needs of both present and future generations. And the third is that justice and equity must be recognised in terms of this concept of recognition and process, procedure and outcome. Now, we all know that our laws basically have a provision in for public input. Technically, we all know that. But I want you to focus on recognition as the first element in justice. If we do not recognise the right to be of all groups in society, how can we ever reconcile with them or further down the road form some form of reparative justice in their wake? Recognition, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Say Her Name, Indigenous rights. These are all cries for recognition. And again, I think recognition is a precursor of justice and needs to be seen as such. So conditions 1, 2, and 3 must then be done within the fourth condition, living within ecosystem limits. Okay? So that's essentially the framework of Just Sustainabilities. And I have to say I'm proud that Just Sustainabilities both underlies and predates Kate Raworth's concept of donut economics, where there's an ecological ceiling, a social foundation, and that the safe space for humanity is Just Sustainabilities. It's that space between being profitable with nature's resources and not letting people fall below the social foundation. If we can get into that donut, and I don't know why she called it a donut, it's the least healthy thing, why not be organic bagel or something like that, but anyway, that's her thing. But it also predates the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals of the United Nations. And I'm proud to say that now those goals are fully cognizant of issues of racial, gender, all kinds of justices. So there's a very, I think, positive noise coming out of the United Nations. But 17 goals, all these particular goals, sub-goals within, there's a lot for local authorities to be thinking about. Now, I want you to think about three things before I give you some examples. Three things in terms of urban planning. What is urban planning? It's managing our coexistence in shared space. Simple way to think of urban planning. Managing our coexistence in shared space. It would be easy to do that if everybody was the same. It would be really easy. But you know what? We live in communities of difference. Increasingly, communities of difference where over a 20-year period, communities can change completely. How do we think about environmental, transport, housing and other conflicts in these cities of difference? How do we live together? How do strangers become neighbours and how do we become good ancestors? Second thought comes to our First Nations colleague who was standing out front of the Parliament building in Ottawa, and he asks about belonging. So I'm going to ask you about the relationship between belonging and becoming. One thing we're very good at in the sustainability field is becoming. What do we become? How do we make our neighbourhoods, our cities, our environments more sustainable? We're always thinking about what we can become. But increasingly, we are denying belonging to a lot of people. And that's why I'm so happy to be part of this welcoming week. I was explaining to Debbie that at Pearson International Airport in Canada, in Toronto, a few years ago, I saw this sign where all the Syrian refugees were coming to Canada, and it said, "Welcome new Canadians." And, you know, a little tear came to my eye. Welcome new Canadians. Would we have said, "Welcome new Americans"? We might have said, "Welcome Syrians" or "Welcome immigrants" or whatever. They call them new Canadians. What a positive attitude. So how do we reconcile this difference between belonging and becoming? We are pushing people out of cities, gentrification, displacement, xenophobia, all of the reasons we can think of why people, might be pushed out of cities, and I'm going to give you lots of different examples. So hold that thought, belonging and becoming. How do we balance the right desire to imagine futures with the ability to encompass all who want to be part of our cities and communities? And then I want finally to think about this notion that the Congress for New Urbanism have, which is the idea of human-scaled planning. It's fine, but I want you to put an E on the word human. I want humane-scale planning. I want planning for human dignity, planning that gives us empathy. I want planning that really helps us think about who we are as people, as human beings. And we don't see enough of that at the moment. Planning is often about economic expediency rather than human dignity. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of policy planning and practice which I think will help you think about just sustainabilities. One is spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? The second is the Minneapolis paradox, what I call the Minneapolis paradox. How does one of the most green liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection of structural racism? And this example explodes the myth that green cities are socially just. They can be, but we have to be intentional about that. It's not just going to happen if we have a green city. Oh, social justice is included. Minneapolis is a really good example of that, as I'll explain. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about food justice. What is local food in intercultural societies? Who gets to say what local is? Because immigrants don't see local food the same way as they so you do. So the first point is spatial justice. So think about social justice. We all know what that means. We shouldn't give favour to people based on race or gender or class. But spatial justice says, how do we distribute opportunity geographically? We already know Harvard University researchers 10 years ago told us zip code is more important than genetic code. That's staggering. Your zip code, where you live, is more important than your genetic code in determining your lifespan and life opportunities. We don't have many cities now which have walls like Jerusalem or Belfast used to have, or Nicosia in Cyprus has. But we don't need walls in the US, all we have is railway lines, freeways, creeks. Who grew up in a town? Put your hands up, who grew up in a town where there was a railway, a freeway, or some dividing line in the landscape, and on one side they lived, and on the other side you lived? Okay, 25% of you. We segregate in the US, and I'm going to come to really the conclusion of one of my pieces that urban planning has become the spatial toolkit for white supremacy. We segregate deliberately, and none of this was by accident, remember. Now, let's go back to this idea of spatial justice then. 2 streets, Massachusetts Avenue on the right, near where I live in Cambridge, and Söderweg and Gothenburg on the left. Those streets are identical width, but they could not be more different in their organisation. In Söderweg, you can see that there's a streetcar, and there's another one in the background. You can see the cyclist, the walker. To the left of the streetcar is the only part of the road that is available to private vehicles, and there's no private vehicles there. The Swedes have imposed spatial justice on the street, and they have democratized the street. On the right, you can see the principle of rights to public space on American roads, and that is, do you have a vehicle? And number 2 is, how big is your vehicle? The bigger your vehicle, the more rights you have. So, 2 very different ways of looking at streetscapes. But if you think about it, how does the kid grow up who lives in the apartment blocks on Söderwegen or on Massachusetts Avenue? How are they wired differently? When a kid is coming out every day to see chaos on the streets, basically organised chaos. But on the left, organisation and democratization. How are kids wired differently? Now, we do have a lot of data on this, and the data shows very clearly that on heavily trafficked streets on the left, there are many more vehicles per day than, say, the lighter traffic streets, but people have less friendships and less acquaintances on the more busy roads. It's not rocket science. You don't need to pay millions in research fees to know that on busy roads, there's less human interaction than on quieter roads. So you might say, well, what's the Just Sustainabilities take here? Well, I'll tell you. Who lives on the heavily trafficked streets? And who lives on the traffic-calm streets? It's as simple as that. And just last week, we've had the NACTO, National Association of Chief Traffic Officers, or whatever it is, conference in Boston, and they released the data. Black kids, Asian kids, Latinx kids are getting killed more frequently on bikes as pedestrians. That's because they live in the neighborhoods with the heavily traveled streets and the dodgy intersections and all that kind of stuff. So, all of this is intersectional. Where you live really, really is important. It affects your lifespan. So, there's good news. We have some good news. I mean, in New York, Mayor Bloomberg, he might have done some things like sending gentrification on steroids, but in terms of road spaces, he really started thinking very positively and very cleverly, I think, about what to do about streets. So on the bottom right now, you have Broadway outside of Macy's that looks like that. We can do this. And survey after survey shows people like it, and especially in the hopefully middle to post-COVID period that we're in, people want to be outdoors. People have rediscovered the outdoors. We can do this. Now, one big takeaway from this is planning has to be about what is possible, not what is probable. If we keep doing what we've probably always done, we're going to stay in the same tired old rut that we're in at the moment, okay? Planning, sustainability must be about what is possible, not what is probable. Now, I told you I would say something about how good we are through urban design at moving people on. Top left. We've all seen those studs. What are those studs for? To stop kids skateboarding, to stop them going along edges. Middle top, we put armrests, so-called armrests. But you know what they're really for? To stop homeless people sleeping on the benches. Even more egregious, top right, we have what I think is inhumane. An architect, urban designer, made the call to put those studs to stop homeless people. Now, I was walking around Seattle this morning and I saw all these little spikes to stop pigeons. What's the difference between those studs and the spikes to stop pigeons? It's the same thing, trying to prevent somebody you deem undesirable, something more than human, you deemed undesirable, moving them on. The bottom right, I don't know whether any of you know about this rich door, poor door issue, but most cities require some affordable units for large developments. But some really cynical developers have been putting doors around the back for the affordable units, and then the rich just go on their high-speed elevators up to the penthouses from the boulevard. So they're called rich doors and poor doors. These have been reported in New York, in London, in Vancouver, so it's a phenomenon around the world. But again, it's segregationist. It is making the poor feel worse as a result of urban design. Now, I've left the bottom left because that is in Seattle, and I don't know whether any of you remember this controversy where the city used sustainability or biking infrastructure to move homeless people on. And thankfully, the cycling community said, whoa, no, we've got a problem with homelessness. It needs resources, it needs policy. Do not use cycling infrastructure to try and move homeless people on. So good on you, Pacific Northwest cyclists for realizing there's a problem, but we will not have sustainability infrastructure used to disbelong people. I mean, that is just the worst thing we could do. The federal government at the moment has put, I think, $1 billion. We need 20, 30, 40, 50 billion, but there's $1 billion for the so-called Reconnecting Communities project, which is removing racist infrastructures. One of my students said, but Julian, a road can't be racist. I said, no, a road isn't racist, but the decision as to where to put the road is, because if you go, if any of you are GIS experts, go online, pull up any US city, pull up the demographics of the neighborhoods, and then overlay with freeways, and you'll notice something really, really, really frightening, actually. So this is the interstate that separated West Oakland from downtown Oakland. Removing urban highways can improve neighborhoods blighted by decades of racist planning. This is spatial justice, but this is also a down payment on reparations. Reparations in the sense of reconnecting communities, reconnects you to opportunity, which has got to be part of reparations. So, so this, I think, is a really important point. But here's the kicker. What do we do with the space when we remove the freeway? If we put parks in there, we will have gentrification on steroids. We really, really, really need to think about what do we replace these freeways with? Now, one idea that comes out of my good friend Elijah Anderson at Yale is this idea of the cosmopolitan canopy. So this point, as a sociologist, is we're wandering down the streets most of the time, studiously trying to avoid eye contact with anybody. Okay? And then there are places, and he calls them cosmopolitan canopies, where we're actually happy in the presence of difference. We watch a ball game, we eat each other's foods, and his example here is Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. And he says there's a level of civility that you don't find in ordinary places. And so eating spaces, kids' spaces are good cosmopolitan canopies. The kids play, the parents and guardians chatter. So the question, is there a role for planning and planners and urban designers in creating these cosmopolitan canopies? Shouldn't this be the goal? Shouldn't this be the goal of urban planning, to create these spaces, third spaces, where we can feel like human beings? I think there's a real role for us. Now, 2 points here. Number one, this isn't going to cure racism, but it's going to get people talking to each other, and that is really important, because there's a theory in social science called contact theory. Contact theory says the more contact you have with people who are different from you, the more likely you are to be tolerant, even willing to help in developing policies that are pro-integration. So the cosmopolitan canopy, I think, is a very powerful concept. Now, I guarantee, and the mayor's here, so let's check, complete streets policies. Do you have a complete streets policy? I'm sure you do. All cities and towns have complete streets policies. And don't get me wrong, complete streets is a great idea. But who gets to say what a complete street is? Complete streets have tried to reverse car-centric planning that has dominated our planning for the last 100 years. But again, are we making these complete streets just for those people in those low-speed neighborhoods, those green neighborhoods, those increasingly white neighborhoods? Is that where we're putting our resources? Everybody should have complete streets. But it seems to me, and I'll show you evidence later, that that's exactly what is happening. So let me ask the question then, what is a complete street? On the right, we have the urban designer drawings of what a complete street looks like. And then on the left, we have, a street that we can't design that street. Yes, that street is in Athens, Greece, but we can tell you how far apart the buildings, we can talk about the bulk of the buildings, the height, the setback, we can talk about all of that. But we can't design in the social ecology of the street. Look at that street. It's a thriving social ecology. And I'm afraid most urban designers come from design-based professions, and they don't really think about the social ecology of the street. And as Doreen Massey, the late great geographer, says, places, and streets are places, have no fixed meaning, rather they are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. Streets are social spaces. Yes, there's a physicality to them, but we have to think of them as social spaces. And most of the complete streets rhetoric, though, is all about design. It doesn't talk about the human and social ecology of the street. To drive this home, I want to give the example of Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles, believe it or not, has a complete streets policy. But until very recently, street food vending is banned. Anybody been to a Latin American city where you didn't see street food vending? Or a South Asian city where you didn't see street food vending? How can LA say we have a complete streets policy and ban two of the most culturally significant practices of two of the largest ethnic communities in LA? Who gets to say what a complete street is? We are witnessing the coalescence of these complete streets programs, and we've got a new term, it's called greenlining. We are greenlining cities, not redlining, it's not racist, but greenlining is having the effect of creating white neighborhoods. The book on the right, Green Gentrification, Urban Sustainability and the Struggle for Environmental Justice, makes the point that these green neighborhoods, or greening, whitens cities. It needn't be that way. I mean, this is not a binary, a cause and effect, green equals white. What it means is, though, that we've forgotten the social justice aspects, which is exactly my point about just sustainabilities. So there are important missing narratives in the complete streets literature. So don't get me wrong, and my book, of course, is Incomplete Streets. So I have to take a slightly, a critical stance. But there's nothing wrong with complete streets as an idea. But what we've done is we've commercialized it, and we've commercialized it to the point where now there is an app called Walkstore. Okay, we all know the app Walkstore. It's measuring walkability, which I would argue is the number one sustainability metric for cities, walkability. How walkable is your city, your neighborhood? Who owns the app for Walkscore? Redfin, the realtor. Let's just pause for a second. Redfin, the realtor, owns the app that measures the key urban sustainability metric in the world, walkability. We've compromised and commodified sustainability to the point now where really only the wealthy, and it's very significant, but in the backdrop to this Walkscore app is the High Line. What has the High Line done? I mean, the High Line, for those of you who've been there, is fantastic, but it is gentrification and steroids all around the High Line. It didn't need to be that way. Housing stabilisation, housing affordability policies, etc., could have been put in place before the High Line was done. So I have no problem with Walkscore, but realtors are now using it as a measure of how how much you can sell or buy for. So again, commodification. I want us also to think about urban parks. This book, again, not mine, but really worth looking at, Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity, not biodiversity, cultural diversity. Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity. There's great evidence now that it's not disuse of parks and public spaces, but it's ideas of design and management that exclude certain groups in society. I would say design, management and programming. Why can we not design, manage and program public spaces in ways that are inclusive rather than exclusive? I want to propose the idea of co-design, co-management and co-programming of parks. Imagine the Parks Department that was bold enough to say, we've got a new park, let's co-design it, co-manage it and co-program it with the local community. Again, this idea then that spaces are not just the local authorities to do what they want with, but they can be co-programmed, co-designed, co-managed by local communities. Now, I want to go back to my chosen city of Boston. There's a fantastic paper, nearly 20 years old now, called Immigrant Engagement in Public Open Space, Strategies for the New Boston. And we're at a very interesting time in Boston. We now have a 36-year-old Taiwanese American, fantastic mayor, Wu. Okay, she's a millennial, a mom, and she's a mayor. We've never had this before. But yet we've got those old Brahmin friends of the park, friends of Esplanade, friends of organisations, and we know who's on those boards. We know the people, and I'm not knocking them. They've done great work, they've raised money. But what happens when the leadership of a city becomes much more diverse than the boards of these powerful organisations? I'm not saying we're going to dig Boston Common up or Boston Garden, we're not going to do that. But what happens to the power dynamic in cities when the administration changes very, very rapidly away from the previous incumbents? So one of the things that I'm interested in is how are immigrants using public space? And there's a great quote here from a Guatemalan American who's talking about the banks of the Charles River in Boston and one particular park in Allston, Brighton called Herta Park. And he says, I think one of the reasons that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park because it looks like home. And this is a principle I want you to really remember. People bring with them their own local. People don't generally abandon their ideas about what is familiar when they come to a new place. So the Guatemalan guy likes to sit, as other Latinos do, by the willows because it's redolent to Guatemala. And I'm sure there are immigrant groups here in the Redmond area that are exactly the same, that they go to places that remind them of their distant elsewheres. Now in Copenhagen, they've adopted a different approach. They've tried to use design to create familiar neighborhoods. And in one part of the city called Nørrebro, which is a very immigrant-dominant area, they've created this space and used artifacts from places around the world to create what is an incredible design effect. And so again, it's like a cosmopolitan county. People come to this space, they want to learn about each other's different cultures. These are just different ways that we can enhance belonging in cities, through urban design, through parks design, through just the design of the urban environment. But I want to move on because I used the word demographics earlier. We as urban planners, we love demographic data. But what the hell does it tell us? It just says 30% African American, 22% Asian American, Latinx. It doesn't really tell us anything about the culture. So what I want to suggest here, with a group from the University of Sheffield in England, is we need deep ethnographies. We need deep ethnographic data about communities. And we could co-produce that data with the communities. I mean, I imagine my city of Cambridge, where I live, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the urban planners spending time developing with communities deep ethnographies that can be used by the city to really understand. Because 20% African American doesn't tell you anything other than there are 20% of African Americans in this neighborhood. We need a deep ethnography of African American worldviews, thoughts, and things like that. Planning and policy would be better if we had ethnographic data. And one particular article that came out of this group, ethnographic understandings of ethnically diverse neighborhoods to inform urban design practice. We can use that deep ethnographic data to enhance urban design for everybody, okay? So my second example that I wanted to give you was this idea of Minneapolis, a green city, best park system, one of the best cities for exercise, most bike commuters, third most bike commuters. It's a green utopia if you're white. But if you're not white, it's not such a good place to be. Racial inequality in Minneapolis is among the worst in the nation. The black-white income gap, what people are paid for their jobs, is pretty poor, as you can see. But the most telling statistic is the home ownership gap, the wealth gap. I don't know whether any of you knew, but there was a Boston Globe survey done about 5 years ago on the average net worth of different communities in Boston. Did anybody see this? $247,000 for a white family, $8 for an African American family. $8, yes, $8. This home ownership wealth gap goes cascading down the generations, and we have to change that. And so in Minneapolis then, you've got this green city, but a deeply unequal city. The opportunity or achievement gap in schools between white and black, between white and Native American is huge as well. And so I was going to call this slide Minneapolis WTF, but I thought this is a polite audience. I thought I better tone it down a bit. So Minneapolis and why? Why is Minneapolis such a problem? And let me just say one thing to start with. Minneapolis is just an example of what goes on in every American city. It's just a particular extreme example. But this same thing happens in every city. So, in 1900, Minneapolis had a small but very well dispersed African American and brown and black population. By 1910, racialized covenants came in. This home shall not be rented or otherwise sold to anybody other than members of the Caucasian race. By 1930, the emergence of the black populations of North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis happened. directly as a result of the covenants. At the same time, we were also banning, the Supreme Court banned in 1917, racialized zoning. So cities were scrambling. What are we going to do? How are we going to segregate people? I know, single family zoning. Let's make it really expensive, you know. And then you have luxury white neighborhoods. And 70% of many cities in the US were single family zoned. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. People made a call to do this. And then, if those two weren't enough, we had redlining. The characterization of certain neighborhoods as being not fit for government or private sector finance, and a red line was drawn around those. So each one of those three was effective, but imagine the synergy, the synergistic effects of covenants, single-family zoning and redlining. And so, of course, the result is racial segregation then and racial segregation now. One country in the world did it better than us, and that was South Africa, apartheid South Africa, where they had pass laws, and you actually had to produce a pass to go between what effectively were different zones of the city. It's recognised. The city of Minneapolis has a very progressive go-ahead Democrat council, and they recognise this task, as Heather Worthington, the director of Long Range Planning, does. But as I've put it, urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. And so what is Minneapolis doing about it? Well, go online, take a look at Minneapolis 2040, which is their plan. And the goal number one of the Minneapolis plan was eliminate disparities, okay? Eliminate disparities. By 2040, Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code. Within that plan, there are 39 different policies, 39 separate policies for eliminating disparities, one of which is environmental justice and green zones, another, as you can see, is park design and programming, recognizing that the city has the best park system in the US, and yet, what was zoned around the parks? Single family. One historian in Minneapolis called this a racial cordon around the parks, deliberate, to keep people out. So park programming and design is part of the eliminating disparities policies. Freeway remediation, as I mentioned. So there are lots and lots of different ways that cities can start to move from what I call racial planning to what I'm calling reparative planning. That's where we need to go. Evanston, Illinois, Providence, Rhode Island, Asheville, North Carolina. Mayors organized for racial equity. More. All of these are groups now of planners, of mayors that are calling for a reparative planning. Not just in terms of like housing policy, which is what Evanston, Illinois is doing, 25,000, to certain groups that qualify. How do we shift the paradigm so that our whole urban planning system is about repair? Okay, reparative planning. Okay, my final set of thoughts is about food, and again, another book opportunity here, folks. Let me leave this up for 45 seconds. And I can check with Amazon if you've done this. So let me just make you aware of that. So what I want to ask here is, what are local foods in intercultural societies? And a bit of a story. So 10, 11 years ago, I was listening to NPR, and the now late George and his wife Julia Bowling run the bowling farm in Maryland. Okay, it's a tobacco farm. The state of Maryland's trying to get farmers out of tobacco farming, and so George and Julia are thinking, what are we going to grow? And then they do a bit of research, and they found out that there's a huge African population in DC. And these people are professors, these people are diplomats, these people are lawyers, these people are policymakers. They're middle and upper middle class, and they want to eat locally grown food that is African. So George and Julia get on to the University of Maryland Extension, and they do some work, and they find, a lot of African crops will grow in the terroir, the climate and soils of Maryland. And now the signboard to their farm is, as you see on the left, produce. And now there's lots of farmers growing African foodstuffs for the local African community in DC. What is local food in an intercultural society? Is it what the foodies, the alternative food movement people say should be there ecologically, or is it what the people, the Africans, just like the Guatemalan who went to the Willows, are the Africans saying, hey, this is our local, we're now living here, let us enjoy our local as we see fit. So what I'm talking about there is what we might call a cultural local rather than a geographical local. And just FYI, so I'm a geographer, there is no such thing as local. There's no definition. There's no signboards when you go to Redmond saying you are leaving local and you are going to such and such. There's no signboard. Local is a relational concept. It's whatever we can agree it is. So if the Africans say this is local, if the Guatemalan guy by the Willows says this is local, if the Filipinos in San Diego, when asked what is local food, they say, well, it's our food. It's what we grow in our cities. It's what we grow in our yards. It's what we eat in our restaurants. If the Filipinos say it's local, then maybe it is local. Maybe we need a new concept, and that concept is translocalism. Immigrants bring their own local with them. Translocalism. And I think we need to be more flexible when we think about farmers markets and local food. What is local food in an intercultural society? If we want to be welcoming, then we welcome different ideas about what local food is. And just north of you, in Metro Vancouver, 20% of farmers in the greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. 20%. And because of anti-Chinese racism in Canada, and yes, Canadians can be racist, they can. They do it in a very apologetic way. But, Canadian, I've lived in Canada for a year on sabbatical, and Canadians can be racist, although they deny it. So anti-Chinese racism and Chinese Canadian entrepreneurialism have meant that Chinese Canadian farmers are growing a much bigger range of stuff, and they're also creating their own farmers markets in parallel with the largely white farmers markets. Now, I gave this talk in Vancouver 10 years ago, and a young East African woman came up to me and said, I'm so glad you said that, Julian. I buy my food from the Chinese farmers markets. They grow the food that I want to grow, that I want to eat. So here we've got, I've just given you several challenges to the orthodox ideas about what a farmer's market is, what local food is. One of the most tragic losses of an urban farm was in about 2006, and this was South Central Farm in LA, the biggest urban farm in the United States. 95% of the farmers, Latinx, including these women from Oaxaca. And if you see, you can see the fence there, but you can see a row of prickly pear cactus. That's what they use back home to make field boundaries. And this quote always gives me a chill. I've read it 200, 300 times, but it always gives me a chill. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. I grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. What a powerful notion that not only are they eating culturally appropriate foods, but they're growing it in a style that is relevant to their back garden in Oaxaca. That's what welcoming is. Allowing people the space and expression. There's nothing here disrespectful about the United States, nothing disrespectful. But it says we need to keep a part of who we are. I eat Marmite. I'm from Britain, I eat Marmite to keep a part of who I am. I know you Americans can't bear Marmite. If you don't even know what Marmite is. I love Cornish pasties, I love sausage rolls, all of those things. But that doesn't mean to say I'm not going to like the United States. No, we need to be welcoming of both the physicality and the ideas of immigrant groups in terms of becoming good neighbours to our newcomers. We also have 50 farms throughout the United States dedicated to what's called refugee agriculture. Newcomers to agriculture from around the world are coming to these farms, which are intercultural learning opportunities. There's farmers from, who've been in the US farming for a long time, and there's the new farmers, and they're learning from each other. And this is New Roots Farm in San Diego. Another book opportunity, folks. This is my second to most recent book. If you're interested in this notion of immigrants and food, it's a very, very interwoven story, because think about our food system. 75% of food chain workers are undocumented or documented immigrants. 75%. And food policy and immigration policy are very, very intertwined. In the UK now, they're having problems with food rotting in the fields because of Brexit, and a lot of Eastern Europeans have gone, and they were the people who were in the food fields, on minimum wage or below minimum wage labour, and now they've gone, and so a lot of food is rotting in the fields. My students are always joking and looking at their watches. How long is it going to be before he mentions Mayor Wu again? Well, I'm going to mention Mayor Wu again because she's my friend, and she is what we need in terms of leadership. She's absolutely what we need. Food justice, and she has a food justice agenda for Boston, okay? Now, I've spent 20 years or so looking at food action plans. Nothing comes anywhere close to Mayor Wu's plan. Food justice means racial justice, demanding a clear-eyed understanding of how white supremacy has shaped our food systems. And so she comes out with a food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. And we now have an Office of Food Justice in Boston, not the Office of Food Access. We also have not an economic development chief, but the chief of economic opportunity and inclusion. She's reframing the narrative. I was talking earlier on about this idea of reframing narratives, using words that include rather than exclude. And that's really, really important. And I'm just going to finish with this favorite headline of mine in the Boston Globe: Millennial Mom Mayor, another way Michelle Wu reflects a change in Boston. She uses public transit. She carries her kids. These are things, I think, that are really important to a new generation. But I think one thing that is very, very important, she is amplifying community agendas. That's what she does. And they are based around just sustainabilities. It's not like she's a mayor that's come in and imposed her own agenda. She's amplifying these great agendas from local food justice, climate justice, housing advocacy, parks and programming groups. So she's doing a great job doing that. So quick summary before we finish. We need to manage our coexistence. I would say celebrate our coexistence in shared space. We need to foster belonging and becoming, not separately but together. We need to engage intercultural, culturally competent planning and policy making. We need to practice humane scale and human scale urban planning and design. And above all, I want to leave you with the thought that social justice never simply happens. It never simply happens. We have to fight for it. We have to centre it in policy making and planning. And when I say social justice, I'm not just talking about racial justice. I'm talking about all forms of injustice need to be considered in our policy making and planning, alongside economic, technical, and other scientific sort of issues. So I'm happy to take some questions before the breakouts, but keep your comments, I won't change. Thank you.
I just am struck by new language buzzing around. Let's do that. I learned this from my friend James Whitfield, 5-finger voting. By a show of your fingers, 1, not at all, 5, yes, very much. How many of you heard something that resonated deeply with you on a scale of 1 to 5? See lots of 5s. Yes. How many of you, as I did, hung on to some language and want to dive more into that on a scale of 1 to 5? Some language, some term sparked you in some way. Lots of hands up. Thank you. If I could get some help from Alex, I want to put up my slide about the discussions. Julian, thank you so much. Dr. Agyeman is going to stay with us through the discussion points. I can't promise that he'll be in every space and every room. We have 3 breakout areas. But I really want to say thank you to our City of Redmond here, Mayor Bernie, our co-sponsors as well, the cities of Kirkland, Bellevue, Issaquah, and Sammamish. One Redmond has been wonderful as well. And we also had our team of co-sponsors that came together and said, we want Dr. Agyeman here, and that along with Eastside For All was FutureWise, Move Redmond, Complete Streets Bellevue, Eastrail Partners, and 350 East Side. So a big hand for all of our supporters. Thank you so much. And we also had funding support from Amazon, and today we've got in-person support from the staff at For Tomorrow, leaders at For Tomorrow, who are going to host one of our breakout rooms. And we also had support from IACS and ELAB. So with that, we have lots to chew on, lots to reflect on, lots of things in our hearts and our minds after that presentation. And I want to give you an opportunity to first and foremost get some cookies, but also to talk with one another. We do have coffee out there and cookies. But here in your breakout rooms, you will have an opportunity to chat with one another. We really want to give you some time to reflect. And most importantly, think about the translation of this information into what you do and who you are in the community. I'm sure that something that was said gave you a window into maybe the way that you've been thinking about things, struggling with the question of authentic community collaboration, for example, in urban planning. And how might this move us all forward as a community? The choices we make, the voices that we hear. So you can reflect on what Just Sustainabilities means to you, and please come up with as much concrete ideas as you can, because we want to highlight those and spread them out to folks that weren't able to join us in person today. So you have some color dots on your name tags, and I want to say that if you have a red dot, you will be staying here after you get a cookie and coffee, of course. If you have a yellow dot, you'll be going into the large conference room, which is 127, and we can have people help you there. There's restrooms on the way as well. And if you have a blue dot, you will be across the hall in the council conference room. All right, and so where is this clock? It's way up there. Let's get to about 2:10 to 2:15, and then make your way into the rooms. And we'll have about a half-hour conversation after your little break here. So please enjoy. Yes, there's a question?
Could you just repeat the colors?
Yes, I will repeat the colors. Thank you. I should have had a slide for that. If you have a red dot, you will stay here. It matches the seats. That's how I did it in my mind. You will stay here if you had a red dot. Yellow, you'll go to room 127. It's a double room down the hallway. And if you have blue, you'll be across this hallway in council conference room. Blue council conference, red here, yellow, big room down the hallway, 127.
So do you know where the restroom is?
Restrooms are down this hallway on the left-hand side as you're making your way through the passage that cuts through the space. All right, thank you so much. We will be back here for a brief closing and a thank you at the end. I hope you'll stay for that as well. And after there's a 3 o'clock networking time out in the lobby in the back.
I thought I saw your
Thanks, everyone.
You didn't, okay. Your name wasn't up there?
Well, I'm definitely buying some books.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that was
Okay, yeah, let's go find your name. Because I was like, yeah, I remember seeing your name because I'm part of the planning. So, I was like, I thought I remember seeing your name there. I mean, your name, rather. Yeah, I think you did it right away. I think you did.